Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Saved by Her Bear by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Duran and Elizabeth Hart. Chapter 1. Knox moved swiftly through the valley, following the edge of the mountain south, remaining far away enough from Black Ridge and Cougar Creek that he wouldn't draw the people he was hunting there. He wasn't sure whether they had made it to the valley yet. Wasn't sure if they were still on their way here, but he was sure of something. Wherever they were, he was going to intercept them and deal with them. He sprinted through the dense pines, moving as silently as he could manage, not wanting to make his targets aware of him. Stealth was key until he knew what he was dealing with. Moving quietly wasn't an easy feat for him, though. At 6'5" and a good 300 pounds of muscle, every damned stride he landed felt as if it was shaking the earth and alerting the occupants of the wintry forest to his presence. For once, being a bear shifter was a bad thing. He wasn't fleet-footed like the cougar shifters at the creek, moved with about as much grace as his animal counterparts, thundering across the uneven snowy terrain. His senses scoured the route ahead of him, seeking signs of life that weren't animal. If he detected anything, he would slow to a crawl, would slip through the undergrowth with stealth. Right now, he just wanted to get as far from the ridge and his twin brother as possible, ensuring that the people who were after Cameo, Lowe's female, didn't find her. Gods, he was going to have to thank Cameo for shooting the human male, stopping him from firing at either Lowe or himself. He knew how much courage it had taken her to do such a thing, had seen how shaken she was by the fact she had killed a man. Lowe would take care of her. He would convince her she had done the right thing, and it had been that man or them. He was also sure Lowe would be able to convince the female not to leave Black Ridge. As little as Knox liked the thought of settling down with one female, he could see his brother was in love with her and needed her by his side as his mate. His thoughts strayed to a pretty bartender and a night 2 years ago. Knox growled as his right boot snagged on a root and he stumbled forwards, arms flailing, barely keeping his balance as he fought to find his stride again. He didn't want to settle down. It was the bachelor life for him. He almost tripped again, huffed and slowed his pace just a notch, because apparently thinking and running was too complicated for him. He jogged past Cougar Creek, checking the occupants with his senses, detecting only shifters and the humans he knew as Ivy and Gabby. No trace of intruders. Saint, his alpha, would send word to the Cougars about their visitors once Lowe returned to the ridge, warning them to be on their guard. Knox paused by a tree and pressed his left hand against it, closed his eyes and scented the cold air. It burned his lungs, the chill of it swift to sap the heat from his skin now he had stopped. He glanced in the direction of the creek, thinking about the other night when Saint had dragged him to a damned wedding celebration just so he could see the pretty little cougar female, Holly, a female who was now Saint's mate. His thoughts strayed to what he had said to his alpha, that he didn't want to be next. Saint had found his fated female. Lowe had found his. It wasn't the life for Knox. He liked things simple, no strings attached, no weight around his neck. Lowe's words echoed in his mind, pointing out that it had been 2 years since Knox had chased a female. He shoved his brother out of his head and pushed onwards, stalking through the trees, his mood blackening with each step. So what if he'd had a period of abstinence? It didn't mean anything. Maverick had taken over handling the supply runs into town while Knox had been busy at Black Ridge, helping out with the cabin repairs that needed to be done in the short summer months. A lot of the cabins had needed repairs at the same time, and it had given him no time to get away from the ridge before winter set in. He glared at the dusting of snow that covered the ground despite how dense the evergreen canopy was above him. He liked winter about as much as the next bear. Should have been asleep right now, curled up under a mound of furs on his bed, not running around in the freezing cold. An icy breeze swept around him, worsening his mood as it slipped numbing fingers into any gap it could find in his weatherproof black jacket and trousers. "Damned things are meant to be top of the line," he muttered as he tugged the bottom of his jacket down, trying to stop the wind from getting under it. Knox focused back on his task as he neared the trailhead, slipped into stealth mode, and silently approached the small patch of snow where several vehicles were parked. He didn't recognize a few of them, in particular a small car and a red SUV, both of which had snow covering them. Not recent arrivals, then. He crouched and moved through the trees just above the cars, gaze scanning them, and stopped when he spotted a blue pickup truck that didn't have a flake of snow on it. He eased down the slope, slipping from tree to tree, approaching the vehicle. There were boot prints in the snow around it, and the tracks looked fresh, undisturbed by the wind. He sniffed and growled low when he scented humans. He couldn't tell how many had been in the truck, but it had definitely been more than one. The only other recent arrival was a black Ford F-150. Maverick's truck. The tension cranking his muscles tight eased a little at the sight of it, and the thought that Maverick and Rune had made it back to Black Ridge. The humans would be no match for the two big bears if they strayed near the ridge. He breathed a little easier, knowing they were on hand should something go down. Fear for his brother and Cameo fading, allowing him to focus on his mission. Knox peered off to his left, back into the trees that covered the rolling terrain of the valley between the trailhead and Cougar Creek. He moved back that way, keeping low, and investigated the tree line. All of the snow was undisturbed. Whoever had come this way hadn't headed towards the creek. He spotted Maverick and Rune's trail to his left up the slope, and wasn't surprised to see they had chosen the high path. It allowed them to reach Black Ridge without going near the Cougars. They must have reached the ridge before he had left, or somehow he had passed them without noticing. It was possible. As much as he hated to admit it, he had lost himself in thought from time to time during his trek to the trailhead. The two bears could have easily gone unnoticed by him if they had been at a good distance. Their faint sense wouldn't have triggered a sense that he was in danger, pulling him out of his thoughts. If he had smelled humans, though, he would have been laser-focused on his surroundings in a heartbeat. He swung his gaze back towards the pickup. Which way had the humans gone? He focused again, reaching out with his senses and straining to hear something at the same time. All he could feel and hear were animals. The scent of the humans was fresh, though, meaning that they had been here recently. Maybe within the last 15 minutes, 30 tops. He broke cover and moved to the truck, placed his bare hand on the hood and glared at it. The engine was still warm. Knox checked all around the vehicle, trying to figure out how many he was dealing with by investigating the boot prints. The snow was a mess, which made it impossible to tell. He huffed, his breath fogging in the air, and turned in a circle, scanning the snow further afield, trying to spot which way they had gone. He stilled as he found their trail. It wasn't heading towards Cougar Creek. He frowned as he followed it, picking out possibly 2 or 3 man-sized footprints, and one set that was smaller. A female? He paused at the edge of the clearing and stared into the trees that covered the gradual slope below him, tracking the path they had taken. Why were they heading for the river? Knox lifted his head and looked at the other side of the valley, at the white caps of the mountains that towered there, dazzling against the blue sky. The dark pines and spruces that hugged the base of the mountains were heavy with snow, too, thanks to the recent storm. He looked back over his left shoulder to the 2 old lodgepole pines that marked the start of the trail to Cougar Creek and Black Ridge. A trail he couldn't see through the fresh snow. Was that the reason they were heading for the frozen river instead? Knox pivoted on his heel and stared at the blue truck, part of him wondering whether it belonged to local hunters rather than the people he was looking for. Dangerous people. Members of a drug cartel. It didn't strike him as the sort of vehicle that someone in that profession would own. But then there was a high chance it was a rental like the red SUV, and the smaller car he figured belonged to Cameo. It made sense that they would rent a vehicle more suited to the hostile terrain and climate. He turned in the direction the people had gone and wound his way down the slope, following their trail. He wasn't going to complain that they had taken a detour and were heading away from Cougar Creek. It gave him time to find them, assess them, and come up with a plan before they got that far up the valley. If they followed the river, it would lead them to the Cougar Pride. Knox had to intervene before they reached it. He had no love for the cat shifters, but Saint was clearly deeply in love with his new mate, and Knox would do whatever was necessary to keep his alpha happy. It wasn't long before he heard the group. He broke off from their trail, heading to his right, using the shrubs as cover as he approached them. They were moving quickly for humans, covering a lot of ground. He peered into the trees, trying to spot them, and froze when he caught his first glimpse of them. Knox could tell it was a male even though he wore his hood up. He was tall, wiry, carrying a red pack on his back that made him stand out almost as much as his bright blue jacket did. Stealth clearly wasn't a concern for them. Knox hunkered down when another male appeared in his line of sight, heading back towards his companion, and he catalogued everything about him. He was shorter than the first male, but he was big, his dark gray jacket covering a body that was more fat than muscle, and his face was ruddy, his breaths rapid as he swiped a gloved hand across his rugged brow. He looked like a bouncer. Knox eyed the rifle he had slung over his shoulder. Or perhaps a bodyguard. Knox bet that wasn't the only gun this one was carrying. He eyed the guy in the blue jacket again and noticed that he had a weapon too, a rifle similar to the one the bodyguard had, only he had stashed his in the side of his pack. Knox slipped silently through the undergrowth, catching up with them but keeping his distance, seeking the others. He wanted to growl when he spotted them further ahead of the duo. It wasn't just one male and a female. It was two, both with their hoods up as they escorted the female. She wore a pack on her back and had the hood of her black jacket pulled up too, concealing her face. Unlike the pack the man wore, her dark green one was larger and heavier, had a small pan and a bedroll, together with a water bottle. She had come prepared for the hike. 4 men in total and 1 woman. Knox didn't like those odds. He liked them even less when the one in the blue camo jacket turned towards the other male and he spotted the assault rifle he gripped. "I'm freezing my balls off." His accent wasn't local by a long shot. It wasn't even Canadian. Knox pegged him for East Coast USA, possibly New York. The other man, one dressed in a black jacket and black salopettes, looked across at him, but Knox didn't catch sight of his face before he was looking ahead of them again. The leader? Knox moved further away from them so he could draw level with the 2 men and the woman without them noticing him. She gripped the straps of her pack and shrugged, shifting the weight of it on her slight shoulders. He dragged his focus away from her and assessed the 2 males at the back. The tall, wiry one had a blonde goatee and was young, no older than 30. Bodyguard had a good 10 to 15 years on the kid, as well as a good 100 pounds, and was guzzling water like it was going out of fashion. Knox labeled him as an easy target if he could get him alone. Hell, they would all be easy targets if he could separate them, divide and conquer. It was the best plan he could come up with. He would pick them off one by one once night fell. Might even knock them down to a man and the woman and deal with them together. Shouldn't be too difficult. He would have stealth to his advantage once it was dark, and if things didn't go according to plan, he would use his bear form. He was stronger in that form, could easily take them down under the cover of darkness. None of them had night vision goggles. They reached a steep incline and had to bank right, following an animal trail down to the forest floor a good 20 feet below. Knox caught sight of the face of the one who sounded like he was from New York, and he didn't like the look of him. There was a cold edge to his dark eyes as he stared at the back of the man in front of him, his finger resting close to the trigger of his assault rifle, as if he was waiting for a reason to fire the weapon. A thick layer of black stubble covered the lower half of his face, but didn't quite conceal the deep scar that darted over his left cheek. Maybe Knox had got it wrong. This was the bodyguard. His gaze slid to the man in front of him, the only one dressed all in black. He was good-looking, tall, and had his gray eyes locked on the petite female in front of him as he gripped the trees he passed to stop himself from falling down the slope to the ground far below. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" His accent was Canadian, and there was a sharp bite to it that made Knox feel this man was used to barking orders and having people obey them. If he had to guess, he would say this one was Carl, Cameo's ex-boyfriend turned drug lord. The one who had beaten her kid brother to a bloody pulp and had then come after her, believing she had the $300,000 her brother had skimmed off the money that had passed through his hands on its way from the streets to his boss. The female nodded and lifted her head as she turned it to look back over her shoulder at Carl. Knox froze against a tree, sickness sweeping through him as he stared at her, his whole plan changing in an instant. Skye. He bit back the growl that rumbled up his throat and fought the urge to break cover and make a grab for her. He had to dig his emerging claws into the bark of the pine tree to anchor himself in place and stop him from obeying the powerful need to get her away from these men. He stared at her, heat swift to bloom in his veins, roused not only by his rage and his fear, but by the sight of her. Gods, it had been 2 years since he had last looked at her beautiful face. But he remembered everything about her, from her stunning, rich brown eyes flecked with gold to the silken waves of her chestnut hair, and that little scar that darted across her chin just below her soft lips. He wasn't sure what she had done to get herself dragged into this mess, but he was damned if he was going to let anything happen to her, no matter what it took. He was going to save her.
Chapter 2. Skye began to get a bad feeling in her gut as the truck she was in rolled up the snowy forestry track. The mousy-haired man at the wheel glanced at her from time to time, as if he could sense her rising nerves and how close she was to calling this whole thing off. Behind her, 3 other men were crammed into the back seats of the blue pickup, none of them speaking. In fact, not one of them had uttered a word in the time she had known them. The only one who had spoken was the man beside her, and what he had said had been enough to not only spark her interest, but secure her as a guide. Something she was beginning to regret agreeing to. Carl had caught her at a low point. He and his friends had been the first customers she had seen in almost a week, thanks to the abysmal weather, and she had been overjoyed to finally have someone to serve, even if it had only been for drinks. Her bar, the Spirit Moose, was floundering and badly in need of a cash injection after 2 very short summers in a row and annoyingly long winters. If things didn't improve soon, she would have to admit defeat. And that was something Skye Callahan just did not do. When Carl had asked where he could find a guide because he needed to go up a valley to visit his friends, she had told them there wasn't a guide in the area crazy enough to head up the valleys in the dead of winter. With the current weather conditions veering towards another storm and recent snowfall, the valleys would be deadly. He hadn't seemed bothered by the potential danger, though, and had asked how well she knew the area. It had been on the tip of her tongue to tell him to find another crazy person. And then he had slapped a fat wedge of cash down on the bar top, all of them $50 bills. She had stared at all that money and had seen the lifeline the Spirit Moose badly needed. It would be enough to keep her afloat at least until summer, and would pay off some of her debts. Not only that, but Carl had sweetened the deal by saying that when they returned to town, whether they found their friends or not, there would be another similar amount of money waiting for her. So she had taken the job. Skye stared out of the cab of the truck at the valley, at thick white snow that covered the track and made it slow going to crawl along it without plummeting into the trees, and at the mountains that surrounded her. Now that the haze of seeing all that money was lifting, and she had gotten a good look at the 4 men and had realized where they were heading, she had come to a conclusion. She should have asked a lot more questions. That feeling grew as they finally reached the trailhead and pulled up next to another car. It wasn't the only one parked in the clearing either. There were several more trucks and SUVs, and none of them looked as if they had been moved in days, possibly even weeks. She had heard rumors that there were cabins up this valley, and now she had her confirmation. Someone was living up here. Quite a few someones. "Does one of these vehicles belong to your friends?" She eyed the row of vehicles. "The red SUV." Carl was quick to answer. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved or more worried as she looked at the car in question and found it covered in a layer of snow that had drifted up its side, telling her it had been there during the recent snowstorm, but not as long as the others parked further along. They were completely obscured by the snow. "I said we would come up for the holidays, but the storm closed in and we couldn't reach the cabin." Carl offered a smile, one that did nothing to warm his gray eyes. He shrugged. "I'm a city guy. Not used to this method of finding a place. Our friend was supposed to meet us at the start of the track near the highway, but when we reached it, he wasn't there." Which was plausible. "The storm blew for a couple of days and dumped a lot of snow. Might be they couldn't get back to their vehicle from the cabin. Do you know which one it is?" She could only think of one cabin up this valley, but there had to be more than that, judging by how many cars were parked here. Carl offered her the piece of paper he had shown her back at the bar. "I only have these to go on. Sorry." He didn't stop her when she took the piece of paper and studied the coordinates scrawled on it. "I know the way to a cabin. We can check there first. It's close to these coordinates." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her GPS unit. Carl seized her arm. "What's that? Is that a phone?" She shook her head. "No, it's a GPS. I use it for hiking. I'll put the coordinates in it and we can use it to find our way to them." He eyed it, a look crossing his face that said he was debating demanding she hand him the device. Part of her was tempted, but she thought about the money. He would probably demand she give him back what he had already paid her too, and she could definitely kiss goodbye to the second half of the payment, even if he let her keep the first. "We won't be able to just walk in a straight line to it, of course." She smiled at him, affecting an easy air to cover her nerves and how desperate she was for the money. "The valley has a lot of ravines and areas where we'll have to go around. I know this place well enough to guide you there along the shortest route. No detours or backtracking necessary." His grip on her eased. "Are there other routes out of this valley?" She wanted to frown at that question, but resisted. "Sure. There's a valley that joins it up towards the glacier. A pass cuts east, and you can hike to the next valley along from this one." He didn't look happy about that as he released her. "Why?" Skye shrugged it off and put the coordinates into the GPS. It revealed a point not too far north from her current position, on the left side of the valley. Strange. She looked in that direction, past the parked cars. She couldn't recall seeing a cabin up that way. But then she had only been to this valley a few times. It was possible someone lived there. The vehicles were proof that people were staying in the valley in the dead of winter, and there were too many for only one cabin. The one she could think of. That cabin was small. Too small for so many people. She pocketed her GPS. "It's a way up the valley, but I can get you there. It's probably no more than a day or two's hike. I'd say 2, given the conditions and how late it is now." Carl nodded and opened his door, allowing a blast of frigid air into the cab. "Let's go." The men in the back seat all piled out of the vehicle and moved to the back of the truck. The biggest of the men, a real bruiser who needed to go on a diet, opened the tailgate and bent over to reach into the covered bed. Skye grabbed her pack from the seat beside her and slipped from the truck, dropping to land on her feet in the snow. She zipped her black jacket up, covering her sweater, and pulled her gloves from the side of her green pack. She left the pack on her seat as she tugged them on and then grabbed it and slipped her arms into the straps. She glanced at the men as she tightened the straps. That bad feeling she had grew exponentially worse as Carl spoke in a low voice to the youngest man as he shouldered a red pack that clashed with his dazzling bright blue jacket. What were they talking about? She eased the door of the truck closed, using it as an excuse to move closer to the men.
I want everyone on high alert. They might have moved from those coordinates.
Kyle flicked a look at the other two men. Skye was starting to wish she had stuck to her guns about bringing her own car and hadn't backed down when Carl had, in turn, insisted that she come with them because they had needed her to guide them back to the track and up it to the trailhead. She really wished she had when the big man and the one who looked as if he wanted to be in the army, with his blue and white camo print jacket, pulled out two high-end black rifles, followed by more guns. They weren't the hunting sort. She had seen plenty of those in her time, and had a lot of experience handling them herself. No, these were military-grade weapons, the sort wielded by bad people in movies. Skye had the feeling that Carl and his men weren't here to pay a nice visit to friends after all. She cursed herself for being so stupid as to think that 4 men wanting to go up a valley in the dead of winter wasn't suspicious. Cursed herself for not asking more questions. And really cursed herself for being seduced by a fat lot of cash. When Carl glanced her way, she pretended to be busy with her pack straps, kept her eyes off him as she tried to come up with a plan. Running wasn't an option. Her heart thundered at the thought of even attempting it. Images of them gunning her down, flashing across her mind, to have panic prickling her spine. She was the only one with the GPS coordinates. Carl hadn't taken the piece of paper from her. Maybe she could lead them along a different route. If she headed for the river instead of deeper into the valley, she might be within range of the nearest cell tower. Her phone burned a hole in her pocket, and she was tempted to touch it, but knew if she did that, Carl would notice. He was watching her closely, as if he was waiting for her to react to the guns the men were now checking over. Her plan was solid. No sudden moves. No revealing how scared she was. She would make up some bullshit about the easiest way to the place they wanted to reach, being via the river, and would take them in that direction. Once there, she would find a way to slip away from them for a moment and would secretly call for help. She glanced back at the men and smiled at Carl as his cold gray eyes narrowed on her. Because she had the feeling she was going to need it.
Chapter 3. It hadn't taken Knox long to figure out that Skye was in a whole mess of trouble. He stalked her through the woods, sticking to the shadows, keeping his distance so the men she was with didn't spot him. His gaze remained glued to her as she navigated another steep incline, heading for the river. She knew she was in danger. That was the reason she was leading the men towards the frozen creek, rather than deeper into the valley. He struggled to tamp down the urge to break cover and go to her, had to fight to deny his bare instincts as he watched her, studying her as closely as Carl was as he walked behind her. When her booted feet slipped and she made a lunge for a sapling to stop herself from falling, Knox took a hard step forwards, his heart shooting into his throat as the need to go to her and help her blasted through him. When Carl grabbed her wrist and saved her, pulled her up onto her feet and kept his damned hand on her, a different urge surged through him. Knox growled low, the hunger to rush the man and punch him hard in the face warring with the need to shift and claw him. The sight of the man touching her had both sides of him wild with a need to defend her, to get her away from the bastard who still had his damned hand on her as he spoke to her. He bared emerging fangs at the male, pictured 1,000 ways he would kill him once he had dealt with his lackeys, and he wouldn't be doing it for Low or Cameo. He would be doing it for himself. For Skye. He couldn't see her face, but he knew in his gut that she was scared as she gently twisted her wrist, easing free of Carl's grip. She was quick to back off when the male released her, reached for the sapling she had tried to grab and turned away from him. Knox growled again as he caught sight of her face and saw how pale she was against the hood of her black jacket. It wasn't because she had almost fallen either. Her head turned slightly, gaze sliding towards her shoulder, as if she wanted to look back.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?